Welcome to Second Look Education. I'm Amy.
And I'm Candace.
We're educators examining what's really happening in classrooms, policy, and teacher preparation. When joy is treated as optional, when professional judgment is replaced by scripts, and when compliance is mistaken for quality, both teachers and children pay the cost.
This podcast is our refusal to normalize that. Are we educating for compliance or for a future of educated critical thinkers?
That question drives everything we do. Each episode starts with a real moment from education, something observed, experienced, or encountered that made us pause and ask, what's actually going on here?
We dig into the complexity, we reject false binaries, and we refuse to pretend that what we're seeing is sustainable. This is Second Look Education.
Hi, welcome back to Second Look Education Podcast. Today, we're going to have Amy leading us in a moment that we need to pause and take a second look.
So it is springtime, and across the country, actually, it's this time of year where we partake in statewide testing. So the moment that started this whole mind shift and all of this, my thinking going in this direction was, my daughters are in 4th and 6th grade, and those are testing years. And my 4th grader came home and said, "Hey, Mom, we get to chew gum during IAR testing." And then I asked my 6th grader about, are you guys like starting to talk about it? And it's not like over the top, that they come home and talk about preparing for the test, but yeah, that they've started talking about it and the like, this will be on the test kind of thing. But, she was very excited that she'll get to chew gum because, that's out of the ordinary. But it makes me especially anxious because I've done a lot of work in this area. I've done a lot of research and writing around high stakes testing, and particularly our statewide testing. And it's more than just gum. It's more than just preparing for the test. And so, the research that I've done looks at the systems, and in my research, I talk to children about their experiences and the policy and architecture, right, that's in place. And so having all this background, it still makes me anxious. It still makes me nervous. And the thing that really triggers that is that my daughters opt out of testing at this point. And so what that means for me and us is that it means meetings, and it means drafting emails, and it means friction. It means friction with the school. And so
with the system, not just the school, the system itself.
Exactly. So it's that all of that comes flooding in when my daughter says this seemingly nonchalant thing about getting to chew gum. So before I start digging into more of like the teacher aspect of it, I wanted to know, like, do you recall your children taking these types of tests?
Yeah, so it's people assume because I was a teacher and an administrator that I pushed my kids to focus and work extremely hard on these state mandated tests. And I do want to emphasize that that's where we're keeping our focus today, is just on the state tests. But one of my kids has severe test anxiety. The other has personal struggles. And so he doesn't care about tests. He's probably more like my son too. So my mentality was go in there, try. It's just a way to see where you're at. And I treated it like any other test, which is the opposite of the schools and the opposite of what people would perceive I would do because I was an administrator. And so I didn't guide them in opting out or anything like that. I don't think either of my kids would have wanted to because they don't like to stand out.
Sure.
They would tell you themselves. But I didn't put any pressure, that you start those like state testing week parties and that kind of thing. And I have a lot of feelings on all that, but it was like, this is just supposed to see where you're at. Go in there, do the best you can, call it a day. Yes, I made sure they went to bed early just because testing is exhausting anyway. It's a lot of brain work. And I made sure they had a good breakfast, but it wasn't like this, you have to do great.
Yeah.
Make sure you focus and read all those questions. And I probably did, though, as a teacher, put more emphasis. And I think I was more because I was fearful of the perception of myself. And so I put more pressure on my students to, use those skills that we practiced and all of those things. And then even as a principal, like knowing that, the school was judged based on how my students did. Um, there were other assessments that I took more seriously than the state assessments. I think there was so much that comes into play. Like even when we transitioned from paper and pencil into devices early in park, the amount of obstacles we hit the day that our students were sitting at their desks for like an hour because the park system shut down. And that's just a basic summary of it. But I remember at that point thinking, this test this year can't even be that significant. Look at all the drama we're having just starting. And I think for my kids, it was like, and then this test results would come and I'd be like, okay, so this is where you're at. We'll see. Like it's one test based on one moment. And I think when we think about these things, it's important too to note like we're human beings. We have bad days and good days.
Sure.
And we know from our classroom experience, students have various situations and lives and moments that they come in with, which makes a big difference. And so just thinking about all of those things, it should be a snapshot. And I know you're going to get into like the weight of it all, but I think as the teacher, I felt more weight.
Yeah.
As the principal, I felt more weight. And celebrating those things. But, even looking back, I'm like, it was just a moment. And before we got started today, I was talking about our own experiences with state testing.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, back when we took the Iowa with Scantrons, guys, with little bubbles, and we had to have our number 2 pencils. And I took it very seriously on the part that I knew I'd do well on. And then the rest was like, you're not going to do well anyway, so just whatever. But if you ask my husband, he'll tell you he would like make funny designs on his Scantrons. And then we had this transition to like even more pressure. And I worked in a large school district and I was a 3rd grade teacher. So that's like that first year of high stakes testing. And I had trouble getting to transition out of that grade because 3rd grade is like that year. And, if you're good there, they want to keep you there. But this is really just an important note when it comes to testing. We were pushed to make sure our rooms had all the posters up, because if you have the posters up and you use them to teach, you can keep them up in order to give the test so students can reference them.
Right. They become part of your learning environment.
Yes, because they're part of the learning environment. And we went on a tour of classrooms that we were told were doing this well. And I walked into this room and I'm not even kidding. It was like an older building and it had like a inward ceiling. So all along the ceiling and the walls were all these posters. And I remember walking out with a co-teacher and being like, none of those kids are looking at that. It just becomes the walls.
But it makes us feel better.
Yeah.
If we post it up there and
Yes.
think, okay, if they need it, they can look there.
But also like, what are we doing if that's what learning is?
What are we doing?
What are we doing?
Let's
Yes.
unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my experience as a teacher, so that's what I wanted to kind of talk about next. So yes, this moment is triggering because I have my own children now. I'm no longer teaching in those grades like you. I taught 3rd grade. And as you mentioned, that's the first year that they take these tests. And I can remember having kids coming in at open house talking about the big test they had to take at the end of 3rd grade, which, by the way, the end of 3rd grade, just as a recap, it's March. Okay.
Yeah.
We have to take these tests before the end of the school year, before we get to all of the content in that grade level, to be, a little more accurate. But I did the same stuff. I did the anchor charts. I was that teacher with the chart paper all over the walls, and we practiced these test taking strategies, right? And did you have the foolproof response for like the math written response? And it was like, if they use these words, I knew they'd get some points, even if they got the whole thing wrong. I was teaching to the test. And it wasn't that I was confused at all about what this system was. I knew what it was, but I was participating in it. I wanted my students to feel prepared, even though I knew this test didn't mean anything to me or to them. But we knew there was accountability attached to those high stakes. And the other part that I, as a teacher, that really triggered me was I mentioned I started teaching I was a special ed cross-cat teacher in intermediate grades. So that's fourth and fifth grade. So my students who had IEPs, right, significant learning disabilities, and they had to take the fifth or fourth grade test. They couldn't read it. And all I could do was stand there and say, I can't help you. Try your best. It breaks your heart, you know?
I just think back to all of our students as we were preparing for their accommodations, and these students who had so many classroom modifications and accommodations, and they did get testing, testing supports, but like it's nothing like they were getting in the classroom. And then we say, here, you have to take this test at the same level as your peers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and we'll talk a little bit about why we have to do that. But this is where my research came from. And so, I happened to be going to school and I had to do a study. And so I wanted to look at this from the perspective of children. So I knew what it felt like as a teacher, right, to do this. And as a child, like I took all these tests, like you mentioned, we took the IGAP and the ISAT when we were kids.
I forgot about the IGAP.
It was IGAP, ISAT, and then we shifted to PARCC. But like we took the test, then we administered the tests, and I wanted to look at what children had to say. And so I started listening to them describing their experiences, and I listened to them as third graders when they first started, and I listened to them as fifth graders, and I listened to them as eighth graders, and to see the shift and how they internalized this whole participation in these types of assessments as just the way it is. They took it on as a personal responsibility to do well on them, regardless of whether their teacher promoted it or not, because they are just embedded within what we do in school. And a lot of what we do prepares them for those tests, right? Whether we explicitly say it or not.
Right. Well, and I'm sure all of you listening can reflect on your own personal experiences. Even if you're not teaching, you can reflect on each of those moments, those tests, and the way they've grown and the way they've changed over time, and your PARCC parties or your ISAT parties. And
so at this time, I was still teaching third grade, and I was researching the harm while administering the conditions. And I couldn't sit with that anymore. And so I shifted to a first grade teaching position. I couldn't sit with it anymore. I didn't, launch a campaign. I didn't start an advocacy group to ban testing. I quietly stepped out of that grade level. And I think it says something about it. Yes, maybe it was an ethical stand, but I think it was just an easier exit for me. Because I didn't know what to do, so it was easy. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep preparing these 8-year-olds for this and putting them through it, knowing what I knew, but I also wasn't prepared to take it on, like take on this whole system. But is there anything else that you wanted to share about your experience?
I mean, my first year of teaching, my students, their foundation had been multiple teachers at multiple grades, and here now you're in third grade, and at the time the rule was they had to pass to move past third grade, and luckily none of them were held back. But I look back and then I'm like, just the pressure of like, it wasn't even the pressure of myself in that particular situation. It was, oh my gosh, I do not want this to decide for these students.
Sure.
I
can't believe the stakes were that high.
They were for a while. It's changed. But and then just like when you talk about like particular students and you've seen their growth, like as a teacher, your students growing, but then it's only March and you're taking these tests that decide if they're meeting this criteria that they haven't even finished. And so I as you're talking, I'm reflecting back on like how much prep I did for students, and some of the test taking strategies are good strategies for reading and for learning, but at the same time, like applying that pressure to students, not even realizing I did, especially as like my kids got older and I didn't put that same pressure. So, yeah, just it gives me a lot personally to kind of reflect on too.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't want to get too lost in policy, but I do want to explain a little bit about why this system seems so immovable. And there's a few big decisions that really make it inevitable in our schools or feel inevitable. So, just as a structure to think about is like federal accountability requires annual testing. Okay, so the federal government, right? States then operationalize that. So they figure out how that's going to work, and then districts have to implement it. They have to normalize it, right? So the systems feel natural to us when in fact they are very layered and very strategic in how they have come to be in our schools. So before the early 2000s, we've tested, right? You tested, I tested. These state tests started in like the 70s in Illinois. So, but the consequences weren't as centralized, right? And the real push with all of this, where it became part of our federal funding accountability measures, was with No Child Left Behind, right? Schools were now publicly labeled based on test scores. But the most important part is that the funding was tied to the testing. So in order for schools, and every single state applied for funding because we need funding, we need money, because states have to fund our education. So every single state applies for this money through No Child Left Behind, and it's reauthorizations. It's a first-time thing, but the big accountability piece was that we needed statewide tests, and so the funding was tied to test scores. And so what that means is, back to like is that opting out is more than just a personal decision when participation is required, right? That's why it becomes such a difficult thing. It feels bigger than just, me writing a little email saying my kids aren't going to take the test, right? It's much, much bigger than that. So No Child Left Behind comes out, says, okay, states, you can have this money, but you've got to take these tests, right? And so they're not making the gains that they thought they would, right? That every child would be passing, would be proficient in reading and math by 2014. The writing's on the wall. It's not happening, right? It's not happening. It's not happening. So as a response, our national governors get together and they start talking about getting some standards together. Maybe if we all worked on national standards, we could boost these test scores, right? And do you recall what those standards were?
Are you referring to the Common Core?
I was.
Yeah. Well, and I think I understand that it's tied to testing, but I do have mixed feelings, not on the standards themselves, but the fact that the idea that no matter where you're at, you would be focusing on those same standards, I think is an important foundation for saying, I believe that every student should be focused on these standards everywhere in order to create that system and foundation, especially for mobility and that kind of thing. But I know that the meaning behind them was so much deeper. So what's interesting about Common Core is I know the intention behind them, but what if the intention would have been to actually make sure everyone was on the same page, and no matter where you moved, you were working through the same standards at the same grade level, and mobility wouldn't be impacted if you had to move school to school, or everyone, no matter which state you were in, had this opportunity. That would be great. But unfortunately, the intention, although it was perceived or made to perceive that way, that was not it.
No. So, and the standards themselves aren't the issue. It is that we tie accountability measures to those standards, right? And so, like I mentioned, when No Child Left Behind it failed to make those gains that it had promised, right? Because that's what happens when you make these huge, grandiose promises and don't set it up, correct? Put the structures in place for that to actually happen, right? You gotta get a Band-Aid. And the Band-Aid was Race to the Top. And so after No Child Left Behind, we're not making progress. Arne Duncan comes out and says, okay, we'll give you more money. Okay, we'll give you more money, and you now are going to have to buy these tests that align to these standards. So you got to adopt the standards. You have to adopt the tests to then assess those standards. So what does that do for instruction?
Teaching to the test.
It drives our instruction, right? And the other element of Race to the Top was that teacher evaluations were then increasingly tied to student performance on these tests. And so, student growth measures are tied to teacher evaluations, which means even more. We are going to teach that. It is job security.
Well, what curriculums were we buying? The ones with the sticker.
Exactly.
The ones with sticker that guaranteed success on these assessments.
Yeah, so the test became bigger than just student performance, right? And even just school funding. It became tied to that teacher's position.
In the mix of all of this, ignoring the systemic issues that cause these discrepancies and the testing looking like it's the answer when in fact there was so much more underneath.
Yeah, and these systems, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, it started to really normalize these data dashboards where every school is sorted and ranked and every child in there and every teacher. It's in the name of accountability. No child left behind. That's a beautiful thing, right? But the way that we are ensuring no child left behind is certainly not equitable and it's certainly not doing the things that it intended to, or that we would have thought the legislation was there for. Another thing that I wanted to kind of mention in this discussion is that the standardized tests have existed long before 2026 or 2001 when we're talking about No Child Left Behind. And I've done a lot of research in this and looked at the history of how these came to be. And one of the things that, kept coming up in the literature back to Horace Mann in the 1850s is and integrating tests of achievement to see student growth. That wasn't it. It wasn't to see how well students were doing. It was never that. It was always with this lens of schools are failing and we're going to give them these tests to prove that they're failing over and over again. It's never in the name of actually doing anything to improve. It's to get the data to shut it down, to be quite honest, and just it just replays itself with every reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act from Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, and we just keep reauthorizing it and actually adding on more and more accountability through the legislation. The last part of the kind of policy legislation that I want to talk about is the 95% participation rule that was built into No Child Left Behind and was part of the reauthorization of ESSA in 2018. So what that means is that the federal legislation, so the federal policy says school districts, states have to test 95% of their populations. So what does that mean for opting out, right? It makes it a bigger issue than just my kid not taking the test, right? It's about compliance, and so when schools have to test 95%, it's structural in the way that then my child has to opt out. So it makes, the school kind of makes it uncomfortable for us, and again, I don't think it's personal.
No, I was going to say from a principal or an administrative perspective, I think I've had one person opt out when I was assistant principal. I think it's like we're uncomfortable as administrators because we don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And we know high above us, we are being told to do these things. And then we're like, well, what do we do? How does this work? Are we allowed to? Is there a penalty? And so I think even for administrators, they're like, what do we do with this?
Yeah. And that's the compliance infrastructure, right? This is just what we do. Everybody just takes the test and we shut up about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to.
Yes.
So it's no shame to anybody. Part of opting out, people might not be familiar with this, is parents can't actually opt their kids out of the test. Is I send, these uncomfortable messages to administrators and teachers, but my daughters actually have to do the work. And so the first year that my oldest she took the test. We talked, and it's hard to have these conversations about bias and accountability and what these tests mean with an 8-year-old, but I try and put it in kid-friendly language and do the best I can. But she opted to test because why? Because everybody else is testing. She didn't want to have to tell her teacher she's not testing. So, but after that, they've come to realize, like, wait, I actually don't want to take this test. And maybe they're just, want to get out of it. And maybe they're just appeasing their mother because she feels so strongly about this, but they do take a stand and they do opt out. But, they have to go read a book in the office, or they're on their Chromebook, whatever that means, in the office. And often they're forgotten about down there after the test. But, and again, I just want to, make sure that I'm being clear that I don't think it's personal. I think it's procedural.
Well, and systemic. And it comes back to that whole compliance, what we're teaching for.
So I think we've already talked about how, this has been going on in Illinois for a very long time, but we just continue to replay the same thing. It's an old hat. It's the same. It's IGAP, it's ISAT, it's PARCC, it's IAR.
We use this word reform, but it's really just recycle and regurgitate. Like, that's what we do.
Especially, and now we're in a Pearson contract that rolled over till 2030s for our testing in our state. So it's not going away. It can't, right? It can't. We have to meet these federal requirements. And so, kind of, what do we do in this system? Teachers, we often comply because, at least I can speak from my personal experience, and maybe you can too, is that when I prepared my students for this, it wasn't out of belief in the system or the test. It was out of survival. That survival is rational, right? I want them to feel like they were prepared, like they weren't walking into this thing blindly.
I think that's the pressure too, is like, even if you don't necessarily agree with the system or the way things are done or any of that, you still want your students to feel comfortable and safe and secure. And I think that speaks to the students who have particular needs, who, this test is not for them, and they're going to go on there. And then what message are we sending? Hey, you know what? This test does not speak to any of the things we're doing, but you're expected to take it. Like, we want students to be confident learners. We want them to feel that growth. And so I do think that is a lot of where the pressure comes from as teachers, like, in addition to our accountability. And there is some pride, like, oh, my class did great on their tests that come the entire year later.
Well, maybe we should talk about that too. What are these tests testing, measuring? When we look at, we can go back in the Coleman report in the 80s. Coleman himself said that these tests do not measure intelligence or achievement, that what they measure is a person's ability to accommodate or assimilate to what it means to be a successful American citizen. It's not intelligence. It's certainly not dynamic or takes into account diversity or, even individual interest.
Well, if we come into the whole reason of why students were educated, if we go way back to coming over here into this land and starting schools, it was assimilation.
That's what makes American schools so
the whole purpose was assimilation. Yeah. This is what you believe, this is what you act, this is how you read, this is what you're exposed to.
And if you do all these things, you'll go get a job and be a productive American citizen.
That's
what we're doing.
And so, and how sad is that we are still having these conversations 250 years later.
Yeah. So I guess, for us as teachers navigating this care, and this like fear and this professionalism and constraint is really challenging. So if you are in a testing grade right now, my heart goes out to you. And so for us at home, I again, the part of this that really, the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it's really hard for me to do this still, even with, this like background of information. It's still hard to walk into those spaces and feel like you're going up against this huge thing, because it's a big thing to push back against. The intimidation is real, but it's something that we're willing to, I guess, push through.
Well, and I think too, we are preparing future teachers to go into these classrooms, and we're teaching them these strategies and the content and all this information, but we're also teaching them to build a love of learning and a love for these things. And then as the older grades, when we start this state testing and all these things we have to prepare them for, and exposure in some states have started like a pre-assessment now as early as second grade to start seeing how they'll possibly do on their third grade test. Because if they don't do well in those pre-assessments, then we need to make sure we give them a bridge program to prep them for those tests. And then it comes back to like, what are we doing? What are we teaching for? Especially if you look at the scores compared to other countries, we are not doing well. And so what is this snapshot in time telling? Who is determining what this, look into this, who determines what qualifies as meeting standards? Who's making these decisions? That also guides the textbooks. Look at the correlation between the two. Meets the national standards, helps test scores, research-based, like all these stickers. And then we lose sight of learning as a whole.
Well, the big business of all of that in our neoliberal education kind of milieu that we're in, for sure, business is definitely part of our education system. And so I guess there isn't a real, here's what we do now for teachers and parents, like I hope. But, I think for all of us, awareness is important. So, and particularly for, our teachers, like recognizing that there is tension in the system that you are working in. It doesn't make you a disloyal teacher.
No, but I think too, like not only so teachers, they're doing the best they can. They're doing the things they need to do. And so it's not a judgment on them. It's not a judgment on administration. And I think it's good for parents to hear this too. So like, even if they don't want their children to opt out, and I know you're going to kind of touch on that, the resource, but like, it's okay to not like pressure, you get those scores. And I've had a lot of friends who come to me with their scores on their state tests, from the year before. What does this mean? And I'm like, oh, well, this is just where they're at. And I think they're often surprised that I'm not like, this is going to determine your future, right? And so, and I urge you to look at some of those sample questions, because I think you'd be quite surprised on what they're asking our students to do.
So for parents, thinking about these tests and what they mean for your children, and knowing that you can navigate the system, and that asking questions is not a form of aggression, that asking about, what types of tests are taken and what the scores are used for, what participation or non-participation looks like. Those aren't aggressive questions. They're like civic questions. They're caring questions. And that like opting out is very personal, and, children have to navigate these systems, and it's not for everybody. I don't want to, have anybody feel like I'm trying to be one way or another, but you do have opt-out rights. And one of the resources that I always send people to is Fair Test, and it's the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. Tons of resources, state by state information, without like this sensationalism about it, really. They just like lay out the facts.
Yeah.
And it's a great source of information. But information doesn't tell you what to do. It just makes your decision conscious. Right? And so that's what I hope this conversation today brings awareness about all of these things. And just, maybe we can't change it all, but maybe if more people are having conversations about it, or even just thinking about it, maybe we can shift the dial.
Well, questioning it as again, coming back to that normalizing, what this has become such a norm.
Yeah.
Why are we normalizing it? How could it look? Or where could the changes taking place?
The best part, and I've read all of this policy and it's all convoluted on purpose, right? But the best part about the most recent authorization in 2018 was there's a lot of ambiguity in the language around what assessments have to be used, and they're no longer like this very no child left behind, like you have to use this test that's aligned to this. So I think there is room, but states have to be willing and open to thinking about these in different ways, the way that we set up our accountability systems, because that 95% rule hasn't gone away.
No, and I mean, we did within our own state attend a meeting, and assessment isn't going away. There are a few changes in the way we're looking at it, but there's a lot to be said. So diving into that policy, and that is really important. And I think just today talking about state testing, and we have so many topics that'll bridge into this and connect to this later in terms of assessment and curriculum. And so this is just the start of it all.
Yeah. So I guess to wrap up, we started with the moment, which was, I guess, to chew gum during IAR, and that small little thing to make that time that seem a little lighter for the kids, right, is what we do as teachers. We offer this preparation and these little incentives of care, I think. But for the kids, it's this gum, it's incidental. For us, and for me especially, it's infrastructure and policy, and so much more rolled into this little package of statewide testing every year that, builds this tension in me that doesn't go away.
Well,
just live it.
Yeah.
Right.
It has me questioning too, like, what are we saying to our children?
What are we modeling, right? When we call this thing inevitable, what are we saying to them?
Yeah. What's the message?
Mm.
So thank you for participating and listening today. I hope you're left with more questions and more opportunities to pause and take that second look.